Dust swirled beneath the relentless Texas sun, settling on the cracked wooden boards of the auction yard and catching in the creases of Jessica Moore's jeans. The air buzzed with chatter, laughter, and the low, anxious murmurs of cattle and horses shifting in their pens. Trucks lined the fence, and the scent of hot metal mixed with hay, sweat, and nervous anticipation. Jessica's hands, calloused from years of ranch work, gripped her worn leather purse, a relic of harder, leaner years. And today, a symbol of how close to the edge she and her son Ethan truly lived. Her boots scuffed over sun-baked earth as she wove through the crowd, faces blurred together. Rough-handed cowboys, grizzled old-timers, and ladies dressed in crisp denim and diamond jewelry, their laughter sharp as broken glass. She spotted Mrs. Callahan, the wealthiest rancher in 2 counties, flanked by a gaggle of admirers, all of them decked out as if for church, not a livestock auction. Mrs. Callahan's voice cut above the noise, mocking as she gestured to the pens, her bright red nails flashing. Jessica's gaze traveled to the far end of the yard, where the animals least likely to find new homes waited, forgotten. Her eyes fell on a small, raw-boned Mustang, his dull coat the color of cooled embers, his ribs stark beneath his hide. The horse stood alone, head bowed, mane tangled, eyes wary and defeated. There was no name on his tag, only a number and a hasty scrawl, unbroken, unpredictable. She stood quietly, observing. The Mustang shied away from anyone approaching, trembling at the clang of the gate. Mrs. Callahan, catching sight of Jessica, arched a brow and turned her attention to the Mustang. With a theatrical sigh, she made a show of wrinkling her nose. Her friends giggled, snapping photos on their phones, already crafting cruel jokes. Jessica felt a flush rise to her cheeks, not from shame but from a fierce, protective spark. Her own life had been reduced to numbers, too, a bank account shrinking by the week, a house echoing with emptiness since her husband's passing, a ranch nearly lost. She saw herself in the battered animal, overlooked and dismissed. The auctioneer's call began, brisk and loud, starting high and dropping lower as the crowd's interest faded. No one bid. The Mustang pawed the earth, every muscle taut. Jessica's hand trembled, not with hesitation, but with the weight of the moment. She knew $200 was all she had, her grocery money, the last cash left from selling off her husband's old saddle. It was reckless, foolish. But something deeper urged her on. She raised her hand. Silence rippled through the crowd, surprise giving way to outright laughter. Mrs. Callahan's voice rang out, dripping with derision. The auctioneer blinked, but when no one else spoke, the gavel came down with a final hollow thud. The Mustang was hers. Jessica felt the burn of dozens of eyes, judgmental and amused, as she pressed the bills into the auctioneer's palm. Ethan, her 12-year-old son, appeared at her elbow, face drawn with worry and embarrassment. Together, they coaxed the Mustang from his pen, moving slow and quiet. The horse balked at the ramp, eyes rolling, but Jessica whispered gently, her patience unyielding. The rusty trailer creaked beneath the Mustang's uncertain weight. Ethan glanced at the animal, then at his mother, his expression torn between hope and doubt. Around them, whispers swelled, snatches of cruel speculation, pity, and outright mockery. Jessica drove home in silence, the truck rattling over potholes. Ethan pressed against the window, watching the wild Texas landscape rush by. The Mustang shifted restlessly in the trailer, hooves ringing out in lonely protest. Dust curled in the wake of their passage, the late afternoon sun painting the road in gold and shadow. As they arrived at the ranch, a patchwork of weedy pastures and sagging fences, Jessica felt the weight of the day settle on her shoulders. Their home was a place of memories, laughter echoing in the kitchen, her husband's boots by the door, the photo of the three of them smiling wide, frozen in a moment before the world changed. The Mustang's arrival felt like the beginning of something new, but also a gamble she could not afford to lose. With Ethan's reluctant help, she led the horse into a makeshift corral, its boards patched with borrowed lumber and old hopes. The Mustang hesitated, then bolted inside, circling, testing every boundary. Jessica watched him, exhaustion warring with determination. That night, she sat on the old wooden bench beside the corral, book in hand, reading aloud beneath the stars. The Mustang stood in the shadows, ears flicking at her voice. Jessica's words mingled with the distant call of coyotes and the soft sigh of wind through mesquite. She read stories her husband had loved, old cowboy legends, tales of survival and hope. Inside the house, Ethan's lamp glowed late into the night. Jessica lingered by the window, watching the Mustang's silhouette, thin and alone. She felt the ache of absence, the space beside her in bed, the hollow at the table. But she also felt something stirring, fragile, and persistent. Outside, the Mustang lowered his head, listening. Jessica closed her eyes, letting the memory of her husband's voice wash over her. She whispered promises to the night, of second chances, of not giving up, of believing in what others could not see. Morning would come soon enough, bringing hard work and harder questions. But for now, under a sky bright with stars and hope, Jessica allowed herself to believe that redemption was possible. For both the horse named Ember and the woman who'd risked everything to bring him home. The Texas dawn was pale and soft when Jessica rose from her bed, muscles stiff from a night spent half listening for movement in the corral outside. She moved quietly through the old farmhouse, careful not to wake Ethan just yet. Coffee brewed in the battered pot on the stove, its scent mixing with the gentle hush of morning. While outside the windows, the world still seemed paused between darkness and the first burst of sun. Jessica pulled on her boots and jacket, stepping onto the porch where dew beaded along the railings. The corral stood silent in the gray light. Ember shifted in the corner, nostrils flaring as he watched her approach, the tension in his body unmistakable even from a distance. Jessica moved slowly, resisting the urge to hurry, knowing how easily trust could be lost with one wrong step. She leaned against the rough boards, not trying to touch him, just letting him sense her presence. There was a quiet patience in the way she stood. She understood something about broken things, about needing time and space to breathe. Ember eyed her warily, keeping his distance, but he didn't bolt. That was a start. Ethan joined her as the sun crept higher, backpack slung over his shoulder, eyes clouded with uncertainty. He studied the Mustang for a long moment, then looked at his mother. Doubt flickered in his expression, but he held his tongue. The memory of yesterday's auction still hung over both of them. The laughter of the crowd, Mrs. Callahan's pointed smirk, the cold fear that maybe everyone else had seen something they hadn't. Jessica forced a reassuring smile, even though her own uncertainty gnawed at her insides. After breakfast, they set to work. The ranch, though run down, still bore the marks of a family's effort. Fences patched and repatched, fields that needed more hands than they had. Jessica and Ethan moved through their chores, always with one eye on Ember. The horse remained skittish, pacing the perimeter of his corral, ears flicking back at every sudden sound. He wouldn't come near the fence, not for hay, not even for the apple slices Jessica left as an offering. But Jessica persisted. She spent her evenings sitting near the corral, a book in her lap, reading softly into the dusk. Her voice carried through the warm air, mingling with the whir of insects and the distant low of cattle. Sometimes she sang, old songs that her husband had loved, melodies that echoed across empty fields and seemed to settle Ember's nerves, if only a little. Every night, she let herself hope that the rhythm of her presence might eventually break through the Mustang's fear. Days passed. Ethan's skepticism deepened. Frustration etched on his face as he watched his mother waste precious hours on a horse that wouldn't even take food from her hand. Their ranch was on the brink. Jessica could feel the pressure of unpaid bills, the sting of empty cupboards, the silent ache of everything slipping further out of reach. There were moments she doubted herself, wondering if she had only made things harder for her son. But every time those thoughts threatened to overwhelm her, she would look at Ember, his fragile frame, his wary eyes, and see herself reflected there, bruised by life, but still standing. One afternoon, as thunderheads gathered in the west and the wind kicked up dust, Jessica noticed Ember growing more restless than usual. She spent an extra hour by the corral that night, speaking in gentle tones, even as the air grew heavy with the promise of rain. When the storm finally broke, it came fast and wild, lightning cracking across the sky, wind rattling the barn doors. Ember panicked, eyes wide with terror, crashing against the boards. Ethan watched from the porch, fists clenched at his sides. Jessica moved without thinking. She grabbed a lantern and made her way through the sheets of rain, calling softly, her voice calm against the chaos. She opened the corral gate, heart pounding as Ember shied away from her. With infinite patience, she coaxed him with soft words, guiding him back from the broken section of fence he'd nearly escaped through. The storm raged, but inside the circle of light cast by her lantern, there was a sense of fragile peace. Jessica's steady presence, the Mustang's fear gradually subsiding. By the time the rain eased and the thunder faded, Ember stood quietly, his sides heaving, but his eyes locked on Jessica. She closed the gate and secured the fence, her hands shaking not from fear but from relief. Ethan watched all of it, silent, a new respect dawning in his gaze. That night, Jessica dried herself by the fire, exhaustion pulling at every bone, but something inside her felt different. The Mustang had tested her patience, her courage, her resolve, and she had not faltered. In the quiet afterward, she sat beside Ember's corral once more, reading until the words blurred and the Mustang dozed, no longer turning away when she spoke. As sleep claimed her in the early hours, Jessica allowed herself to believe in the small victories. Bringing Ember home had been more than an act of rescue. It was an act of faith, a promise to herself and to her son that even in a world that seemed determined to break them, hope could find its way back, if only you opened the gate and let it in. Word spread quickly in small Texas towns. By the second morning after Ember arrived, Jessica could sense it in the way the phone rang just a little too long before falling silent, in the sidelong glances from neighbors who passed by on the main road, in the subtle but unmistakable chill at the local feed store. The story traveled faster than truth. Jessica Moore, the widow with nothing left but a crumbling ranch, had paid good money for a wild Mustang no one else wanted. The horse, people said, was a waste. Too skittish, too old, too broken to be any good for working, racing, or even looking pretty out in the pasture. Mrs. Callahan, never one to let gossip die, made sure to fuel the fire. She told the story at the post office and again at church, her voice carrying above the crowd as she painted a picture of Jessica's supposed desperation and foolishness. Sometimes, Jessica caught sight of Mrs. Callahan's bright hat bobbing along the fence line as she happened to ride by with her circle of friends. Laughter would follow, drifting on the wind and landing sharp as thorns. Jessica did her best to ignore it, but it was harder for Ethan. School was supposed to be a refuge, but instead, he found himself at the center of every joke. The other boys, emboldened by their parents' whispers, teased him relentlessly. They made up names for the Mustang, calling him Ghost, Bag of Bones, and worse. They laughed about his mom's decision, acting out the scene of the auction in exaggerated voices. Ethan tried to stand tall, but the weight of the humiliation pressed down on him, making each day longer than the last. At home, Jessica noticed the change in her son, the quiet way he moved through his chores, the way he lingered in the barn to avoid the kitchen, the bitterness that crept into his tone when he spoke about the ranch. She wanted to shield him, but she knew from her own life that some things couldn't be protected against. Instead, she offered him work, real work with tools and sweat and a sense of purpose. They repaired the fence together, patched the leaky roof, and cleared the weeds from the garden. She hoped the rhythm of shared effort might remind him that they were still a family, even if the world around them thought otherwise. Ember, meanwhile, remained a presence both mysterious and fragile at the edge of their lives. Each morning, Jessica walked to the corral, bringing fresh water and hay, leaving an apple or a carrot at a respectful distance. She spoke in gentle tones, never pushing, never rushing. Ember watched her, sometimes coming close enough that she could see the uncertainty in his eyes, sometimes backing away with a shudder at the sound of her footsteps. The process was slow, painfully slow, but Jessica recognized something familiar in the Mustang's cautious approach. It was the same reluctance she felt every time she stepped out into a world that no longer seemed to have a place for her. On weekends, the jeers from town seemed louder, the weight of doubt heavier. Jessica found herself questioning her own motives, replaying the moment at the auction again and again in her mind. Was it stubbornness that had driven her to raise her hand, or something deeper, a need to prove, to herself as much as anyone, that broken things could still be saved? At night, after Ethan had gone to bed, she sat by Ember's corral, watching the horse's silhouette move through the shadows, searching for a sign that she hadn't made a terrible mistake. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Jessica caught sight of Mrs. Callahan and her friends parked on the hill above the ranch. Their laughter floated down, brittle and clear, as they watched her in the fading light. Jessica's fists clenched, but she didn't look away. Instead, she moved closer to Ember, standing with her back straight, willing herself not to shrink under their gaze. The Mustang watched her, head high, as if sensing the tension in the air. Inside the house, Ethan sat alone at the table, his homework forgotten. He could hear the distant laughter, the sharp rise and fall of voices, and he wondered if things would ever get better. The ranch, once a place of comfort, now felt heavy with expectation and disappointment. He thought of his father, the way he used to fix everything with a joke or a steady hand, and wished for some of that certainty now. But the world kept turning. Each morning brought new challenges, new doubts, and yet Jessica refused to give in. She reminded herself of her promise, to the Mustang, to her son, and to herself. She would not be defined by the judgment of others, nor would she let their scorn dictate the future of her family or the life of the animal she had chosen to save. As the days slipped by, Jessica's resolve hardened. She understood that true change never came easily. It required patience, endurance, and the courage to face mockery without letting it seep into your soul. And so, as autumn winds began to cool the Texas air, she set her jaw, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to meet each day with quiet strength, knowing that every small act of kindness, every hour spent beside Ember, was an act of defiance against the darkness pressing in around them. The autumn air settled over the ranch, the relentless Texas heat giving way to cooler winds that carried the scent of mesquite and the promise of rain. The world seemed quieter in those days, as if the land itself was pausing to watch what would unfold between the woman and the wild Mustang. For Jessica, time became measured not by hours or days, but by the slow progress of trust, earned and lost, step by tentative step. Jessica kept her routine steady, knowing the importance of consistency to a creature that had only known uncertainty. Each morning before sunrise, she would approach the corral, moving with deliberate calm. She carried apples in her pocket and a quiet determination in her posture. She did not call out or reach for Ember, but simply sat on an overturned bucket just outside the fence, reading aloud or humming softly, letting her presence settle into the rhythm of the ranch. At first, Ember stayed far from her, watching with a mixture of suspicion and longing. His movements were tense, every muscle coiled to spring away at the slightest threat. When the wind rattled a loose board or a stray dog barked in the distance, he would startle, his entire body shivering with remembered fear. Yet each day, he seemed to hesitate a little less before returning to the shade of the mesquite tree at the center of the corral. Jessica never forced him. If he retreated, she let him. If he drew near, she let him, too. There were days of progress, and days that felt like defeat, mornings when Ember would take a step closer, and afternoons when a sudden noise would send him bolting to the far end of the enclosure. She learned to savor the small victories, the flick of an ear in her direction, the way he no longer flinched at her voice, the moments when he stood still as she passed by the fence. Ethan watched his mother's efforts with a mixture of hope and frustration. He wanted to see results, wanted to show the world and their doubting neighbors that his mother's faith was not misplaced. But the process was agonizingly slow, and sometimes it seemed as though nothing would ever change. One evening, as clouds gathered on the horizon and the first rumble of thunder rolled across the fields, Ethan's patience wore thin. As darkness fell, the wind picked up, bending the trees and setting the animals on edge. Jessica hurried to check the corral, sensing the tension in the air. Ember paced nervously, eyes rolling at each flash of lightning. Then, with a sudden crash, the wind tore loose a section of the old fence. The Mustang saw his chance and bolted, his hooves tearing up the ground as he vanished into the night. Jessica's heart thudded painfully as she grabbed a flashlight and set out after him. The rain began to fall in earnest, cold and sharp, soaking her to the bone. She moved slowly, calling softly, her voice lost in the roar of the storm. For hours, she searched the dark fields, following hoofprints and broken branches, never raising her voice above a whisper, never giving in to panic. At last, near the creek that cut through the back of the property, she found Ember trembling in a stand of willow trees, wild-eyed and exhausted. She didn't try to approach, only sat quietly in the mud, letting him see her. No threat, no expectation, just a presence in the storm. After what felt like a lifetime, Ember's breathing slowed, and he allowed Jessica to inch closer, her hand outstretched but empty. With careful patience, she guided him back toward the ranch, her voice steady even as the rain stung her cheeks and the mud sucked at her boots. She spoke of the sun rising, of safe fences and warm stalls, painting pictures of comfort and safety with words alone. Ember moved slowly, but he moved, never taking his eyes off Jessica. When they finally reached the corral, Jessica mended the fence as best she could in the downpour, her hands numb but her spirit unbroken. That night, soaked and shivering by the kitchen stove, Jessica allowed herself a moment of relief. She had brought Ember home again, not with force but with quiet persistence and an unwavering promise of safety. The Mustang stood just outside the window, shaking the rain from his coat, no longer trying to escape but watching the house as if finally considering it a place where he might belong. From that day forward, the smallest gestures carried new meaning. When Jessica sat by the fence, Ember would drift closer, drawn by the gentleness in her manner. She began offering him apples from her open palm, letting him decide when to accept her gifts. Sometimes his lips would brush her fingers, quick and uncertain, but enough to light a flicker of hope in Jessica's chest. Ethan, witnessing the gradual change, began to believe again, not just in Ember, but in the possibility that broken things could heal with enough time and patience. On quiet evenings, the three of them, woman, boy, and horse, shared the golden hush of dusk, each learning in their own way that trust was not given all at once, but earned with every act of kindness and every moment of steadfast presence. The ranch remained fragile, threatened by doubt and debt and the memories of loss. But in the growing bond between Jessica and Ember, there was a new resilience, one that refused to be extinguished, even by the fiercest storms. The rhythm of autumn became a slow but steady march toward something almost like hope. Jessica's days blended into a patient routine of chores and quiet visits by Ember's corral. Though doubt still lingered, every small change was cherished. The ranch was not saved. Bills continued to pile up. Fences still needed repair. But in the gentle dance between woman and Mustang, something unspoken was healing on both sides of the fence. It was early one morning, just before sunrise, when a quiet miracle happened. The sky was a pale shade of violet, the land covered in a silver mist that blurred the lines between dreams and waking. Jessica moved through her chores almost by instinct, carrying buckets, checking latches, her breath visible in the crisp air. She paused by the corral, humming softly to herself, an old tune her husband used to sing on mornings like this, something sweet and steady, barely more than a lullaby. Ember stood near the far side of the enclosure, his coat now brushed to a muted shine, his eyes softer than before. For a long moment, Jessica just watched him, letting the morning pass between them. Then, for the first time, Ember lifted his head and stepped forward. Not the nervous, skittering movement of an animal on the verge of flight, but a hesitant, intentional approach. He closed the distance between them, drawn by the familiar melody, as if the music itself had finally cracked the shell around his heart. Jessica's heart pounded as she reached out, her hand steady, palm open and empty. Ember paused, nostrils flaring, the space between them charged with possibility. Then, slowly, he leaned forward and allowed her fingers to brush his muzzle, warm, soft, and trembling. It was a brief, fragile moment, but in that instant, the long months of waiting, of patience and worry and heartbreak, seemed to fade away. For Jessica, It was as if she had been touched by hope itself. Ethan, who had watched the scene unfold from the back porch, burst out in a breathless laugh, his doubts momentarily forgotten. He ran to his mother's side, unable to contain his excitement. Jessica smiled, her eyes bright with tears that she quickly blinked away. Together, mother and son lingered beside the Mustang, marveling at how such a small gesture could feel like the world tilting back toward the light. The breakthrough transformed their days. Jessica's confidence grew with every new attempt. She kept her movements slow and gentle, speaking in a soft voice, always aware of how quickly fear could return. Ember still startled at sudden noises, and sometimes he would retreat to his corner for hours, but now he came back sooner each time, curiosity overcoming caution. With each small step, Ethan's skepticism melted into hope. He offered Ember bits of carrot and apple, learning to wait as patiently as his mother had. He talked to the Mustang as he fed him, sharing stories about school and his father, about things that had been lost and things he wished for. Sometimes he would read aloud from his textbooks, or sit in silence, his presence enough to reassure both himself and the animal. Their tiny victories became a kind of glue, holding together a family that had felt so close to falling apart. Jessica began to involve Ethan in every part of Ember's care. Together they brushed his mane, learning the gentle rhythm that soothed both horse and human. They swept the corral, cleaned the trough, and even mended the old gate with scraps of wood and determination. Each act was a small promise, to keep trying, to keep believing, to keep moving forward, no matter how slow the progress. Outside their little circle, the world remained unconvinced. Neighbors still whispered, and Mrs. Callahan still found reasons to ride by and sneer, her champion horse prancing at her side. But Jessica paid them little mind. She had learned that some things could not be rushed, nor could they be explained to people who were determined not to understand. Her faith was quiet but unbreakable, grounded in the subtle changes she saw every day. As autumn deepened and the air grew colder, Jessica and Ethan began to see the Mustang they had hoped for in Ember. His coat gleamed in the slanting light of sunset. His body grew stronger, his movements less wary, and a kind of partnership began to take root. In the hush of twilight, as the sky blushed pink over the ranch, the three of them, woman, boy, and Mustang, stood together, breathing in the peace that followed so many months of storm. That night, Jessica sat by the kitchen window, watching Ember graze in the fading light. She let herself imagine a future in which he would become not just a symbol of what they had survived, but a partner in whatever new beginning awaited them. For the first time in a long while, she believed it might be possible. With winter on the horizon and the first hints of frost crisping the edges of morning grass, Jessica knew that the time had come to move from gentle contact to real partnership. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that training a Mustang could not be forced. Ember's wounds, visible and invisible, ran deep, and the methods most ranchers used would only reinforce his fear. Instead, Jessica set out to teach him her own way. Not with a whip or harsh commands, but with patience, ritual, and quiet persistence. Each day, just before dawn, Jessica slipped from the warmth of her kitchen into the cool, starlit world outside. She moved with intention, making every gesture clear and predictable. Sometimes Ethan joined her, rubbing sleep from his eyes, eager now to help in whatever way he could. Together, they carried buckets of water, forks of hay, and pockets full of cut-up apples and carrots. small offerings in exchange for Ember's growing trust. Jessica began the training not by leading, but by walking alongside the Mustang, her footsteps matching his rhythm. She spoke softly, humming under her breath, careful not to startle him. They walked slow circles around the corral, day after day, until Ember no longer flinched when her shoulder drew close to his. The routine was meditative, the scrape of hooves on packed earth, the breath of the horse rising in gentle clouds, the soft rustle of hay as Ethan watched from the gate, learning as much from silence as from instruction. The cold sharpened the air, but it also seemed to clear Ember's mind. Each morning he grew bolder, stepping forward to greet Jessica, accepting a brush across his neck, a hand over his flank. Jessica included Ethan in every new step, teaching him how to hold the brush, how to approach slowly, how to listen for the tiny signals that told them Ember was at ease or on edge. These rituals of care became their anchor. They brushed Ember's mane, untangling it strand by strand, working side by side in the hush before sunrise. Meals, too, became a source of connection. Jessica and Ethan began eating breakfast outside on the old bench near the corral, sharing bits of toast and fruit, letting Ember watch them with growing curiosity. Sometimes, when the weather was warm enough, Jessica read aloud from a battered collection of Western stories, her voice rising and falling with the cadence of memory and hope. On the best mornings, Ember crept close enough to rest his nose on the rail, his eyes bright and alert, as if listening to the story unfold. Progress was not always linear. There were setbacks, days when Ember would spook at a stray dog's bark or a gust of wind, retreating to the far side of the corral, shivering with nerves. Jessica never showed frustration. She waited, letting the Mustang set the pace, trusting that what was lost could be found again if she kept showing up. Ethan, watching his mother's unwavering patience, began to change too. The teasing at school no longer stung as sharply. The work at home felt meaningful in a way he had not expected. As winter deepened, Jessica tried new things, improvising with what she had. With no money for expensive tack, she fashioned makeshift halters and leads from old rope, teaching Ember to accept their touch. At first, the horse tensed at the sensation, eyes wide with memory and fear. But Jessica was gentle, coaxing him with words, her hands steady. She showed Ethan how to slip the loop over Ember's nose, how to reward every calm moment with a treat, a gentle word, or simply a shared silence. Some mornings, Jessica led Ember out of the corral and into the pasture, keeping the rope loose and her movements slow. The world outside was bigger, full of strange scents and sounds, but Ember's confidence grew. He learned to walk beside Jessica, then behind her, following her lead with tentative steps. Ethan ran ahead, turning back to watch, cheering quietly as the Mustang ventured further each time. As the bond between horse and humans deepened, Jessica saw a change in Ember's eyes. The fear was still there, but it was joined by curiosity, a willingness to learn, to trust, to move forward together. Each day brought small improvements, some almost imperceptible, but all building toward something stronger. The old wounds of the past no longer defined them. Instead, it was the slow accumulation of gentle moments, the rituals they shared, that shaped their new life. Evenings on the ranch became a time of quiet celebration. Jessica and Ethan sat by Ember's corral, watching the stars blink into view above the wide Texas sky. They talked about the future, about the possibility of entering Ember in the upcoming county festival. though it still seemed a distant dream. For now, it was enough to watch Ember doze peacefully in his stall, his breath steady, the old panic gone. In the hush that followed each long day, Jessica knew she had chosen the right path, not just for Ember, but for herself and her son. Their unconventional training, rooted in kindness and patience, was forging something rare and strong, a bond that could not be broken, no matter what storms might come. Winter's grip finally loosened, giving way to cool spring winds that swept across the prairie and stirred the wildflowers to life. The ranch, battered by hardship, began to show the faintest hints of renewal. Each day, Jessica, Ethan, and Ember continued their steady progress. The Mustang was now a constant presence, moving with a confidence that would have seemed impossible just a few months before. His coat glowed in the sunlight, the old hollowness gone from his frame. Jessica felt a similar transformation within herself. For the first time since her husband's passing, hope had taken root, not loud or boastful, but steady and quietly persistent. Word of Ember's progress drifted beyond their property line, whispered through fence posts and over cups of coffee at the feed store. Some remained skeptical, holding on to their old doubts. Others watched with cautious curiosity, but none watched more closely than Mrs. Callahan. Her pride in her champion horses was well known, and she made a point of riding by the Moore Ranch, her posture straight, her eyes sharp beneath her wide-brimmed hat. Sometimes she slowed at the gate, making a show of observing Ember's training sessions, her lips curling in a knowing smile. It was at the monthly meeting in town, beneath the buzzing lights of the community hall, that Mrs. Callahan made her move. She rose before the crowd, her voice ringing clear and confident, challenging Jessica to enter the upcoming county festival's endurance race. There was a theatrical quality to her announcement, her words dripping with the assurance that this would be an easy victory for her own prized thoroughbred. She reminded everyone of the prize money, enough to save a struggling ranch, enough to stir the interest of every ear in the room. There was no missing her message. Jessica's journey with Ember, once a private battle, was now a public spectacle. Jessica felt the weight of every eye, every expectation pressing in around her. She hesitated, unsure whether this was an opportunity or a trap. Her ranch was still on the brink, held together by hope and little else. The race was grueling, a test even for the finest horses, let alone a Mustang who just months ago was frightened of a halter's touch. She knew the cost of failure would be more than embarrassment. It could mean the loss of everything she had worked so hard to protect. Back at home, Ethan was the first to speak of the challenge. His voice, once uncertain, now brimmed with belief. He reminded his mother of how far Ember had come, of how many obstacles they had already overcome. His faith was contagious. That night, as Jessica sat by Ember's corral, she let her hand rest on the Mustang's withers and wondered if perhaps her son was right. Maybe the journey had prepared them for something bigger. Maybe, by standing up to Mrs. Callahan, they could show everyone, including themselves, that second chances were worth fighting for. Preparation began in earnest. Each day, Jessica and Ethan trained Ember with newfound purpose. There were no professional trainers, no expensive gear, just homemade tack, determination, and a schedule that bent around the endless chores of ranch life. Ethan set up makeshift obstacles along the trails, logs to step over, tarps to cross, sudden noises to withstand. Jessica adjusted their training routes to build Ember's stamina, gradually lengthening their rides, sometimes before dawn, sometimes in the cool hush after sunset. Neighbors watched from a distance, curiosity and skepticism mingling on their faces. Some, remembering the old stories of wild Mustangs, predicted disaster. Others began to root for Jessica, quietly offering advice or a helping hand, their old doubts replaced by something closer to admiration. Even so, Mrs. Callahan maintained her confidence. She boasted at the feed store, describing her horse's pedigree, his years of training, the certainty of her victory. Jessica listened in silence, refusing to let her opponent's confidence rattle her own resolve. There were setbacks, of course. Days when Ember grew tired or spooked at a sudden sound. Moments when Jessica wondered if she was asking too much of him, or of herself. But each time, Ethan was there to steady her, to remind her of all they had already achieved. They celebrated small milestones. The first time Ember crossed the creek without balking. The first time he tolerated a sudden shout or a waving flag without bolting. Night after night, as Jessica drifted off to sleep, she replayed each day's progress in her mind. She thought of her late husband, of how he had always believed in her, even when she couldn't believe in herself. She remembered the promise she had made, to keep fighting, to keep hoping, no matter how uncertain the outcome. As race day approached, tension and anticipation wove their way through every part of ranch life. Jessica felt it in the early morning air, in the way Ember's ears pricked forward when she approached, in the quiet confidence growing inside Ethan. The challenge was daunting, but for the first time in a long while, Jessica did not feel alone. She had her son, her Mustang, and a second chance, hard-won, fiercely protected, and now, perhaps, just within reach. The announcement of Jessica's entry in the festival race rippled through the county, stirring old rivalries and new rumors. For some, it became the latest source of gossip at the diner or in the pews at church. For Jessica and Ethan, it was the only thing that mattered. They faced the coming weeks with a kind of determined urgency, the fate of the ranch now tied to a gamble on a horse who'd only recently learned to trust a gentle hand. Each morning began before sunrise. Jessica pulled on her boots, her mind already sorting through the day's tasks, chores to keep the ranch afloat, and training to turn Ember into a competitor. They had no money for a proper trainer or professional gear, so Jessica improvised. The saddle was mended with old leather scraps, the bridle stitched together with Ethan's help under the dim kitchen lamp. Every imperfection reminded her of the stakes, and every repair became a quiet act of hope. Training was a family affair. Ethan charted out practice routes using hand-drawn maps, mapping distances across the rough pasture and weaving trails through the stands of mesquite. They measured Ember's progress not in flawless performance, but in small daily victories. A smooth canter along a fence line, a calm response to a waving feed sack, a sure-footed climb over rocky ground. Jessica never raised her voice, never rushed. She let the rhythm of Ember's breathing guide their pace. Yet, for all their progress, the odds never seemed more daunting. The festival drew closer, and each day brought new reminders of the difference between the Moors and their rivals. Mrs. Callahan made a spectacle of her preparations. Her horse, a polished bay with lines as smooth as glass, trained with a local champion under the watchful eyes of an audience. She paraded her confidence through town, tossing sharp glances Jessica's way, spinning stories about Ember's supposed failures and the certain folly of entering a wild horse in a race meant for the county's best. Jessica felt the pressure. She saw it in the wary glances of the townspeople and the way her own hands shook sometimes when she tightened Ember's girth. She felt it in Ethan's questions. Would Ember really be ready? What if they lost? Would the ranch survive another setback? Jessica gave no easy answers, because there were none. Instead, she focused on what they could control. She taught Ethan how to check Ember's hooves for stones, how to watch for subtle signs of fatigue, how to coax out every bit of strength and heart the Mustang had to offer. Some days, the ranch itself seemed to fight against them. A fence post would splinter in the night, letting the cattle wander. The pump faltered, forcing Jessica to haul water by hand. There were moments when frustration threatened to break her resolve, when the exhaustion of hope felt heavier than any physical task. In those moments, Jessica leaned on the routine. Early rides at dawn, careful grooming, quiet evenings reading by the corral, and on Ethan's faith, which, even when shaken, never entirely disappeared. Their bond with Ember deepened. The Mustang learned to respond to Jessica's cues, picking up her moods and slowing when she was tired, pressing forward when she needed encouragement. Ethan found his own role, jogging alongside on the early runs, offering encouragement and laughter when Jessica's spirits flagged. Sometimes he'd tell stories from school, little victories and defeats, sharing the load of doubt so that his mother would not have to carry it alone. Neighbors came and went, some offering curious glances, others lending a hand without comment. A bale of hay would appear by the barn, or a set of well-worn reins left hanging on the fence. These gestures, small and anonymous, reminded Jessica that their struggle was not entirely theirs alone. Even in a place where gossip flowed freely, kindness ran just as quietly. Nights were the hardest. Jessica often found herself awake, listening to the wind rattle the old windows, replaying every mistake she might have made, every step she might have missed in Ember's training. But each dawn brought another chance, a new stretch of trail, a fresh start, another opportunity to believe that the impossible could be made real. As the festival drew near, a sense of anticipation pulsed through the ranch. Ethan grew restless, counting down the days, fixing the old truck so they could haul Ember to town. Jessica sharpened her focus, reviewing every detail, determined to prepare as best she could. She watched Mrs. Callahan parade her horse at the edge of their property, the polished tack gleaming in the sun, and she refused to look away. She had made it this far not by bowing to pride or fear, but by trusting the slow, stubborn progress of patient hearts. On the eve of the festival, Jessica stood alone beside Ember's corral, the sky streaked with the last gold of sunset. She traced her hand along the Mustang's neck, feeling the steady thump of his pulse, the warmth of his trust. Whatever happened tomorrow, win or lose, first or last, she knew they had already accomplished something no one could see but her and her son. They had taken what the world discarded and made it beautiful, strong, and worth believing in. Morning arrived pale and cold, the kind of day that seemed to hold its breath. Jessica woke before dawn, nerves twisting in her stomach. She dressed in the half-light, pulling on her best shirt, one that had seen years of hard work, but still felt like armor for uncertain days. Ethan moved quietly, his excitement and anxiety tangled together, hands steady as he loaded the last of their supplies into the battered pickup. Ember was calm, as if he sensed that this day was different, but his ears flicked nervously at the unfamiliar scents of saddle soap and fresh oats. The ride to town was silent, headlights carving twin paths through the blue-gray mist. Jessica's hands gripped the steering wheel, her mind full of everything and nothing at once. Her husband's voice, Ethan's faith, the faces of neighbors who would be watching, and the ranch itself, waiting for the outcome of a gamble no one else would have made. At the festival grounds, the world was transformed. Banners fluttered above the crowd. Music and laughter mingled with the neighing of horses and the barked instructions of handlers. It was a spectacle, bright and loud, worlds away from the quiet work of the ranch. Competitors milled around the starting line, their horses glossy and restless. Mrs. Callahan stood among them, her posture regal, her bay gelding gleaming in the early sun. Her eyes found Jessica and Ethan as they unloaded Ember, a smile flickering at the corners of her mouth, full of certainty and dismissal. Jessica forced herself not to look away. She focused on Ember, checking every strap, brushing dust from his coat, whispering reassurances she barely believed. The crowd was thick with neighbors, faces familiar and unfamiliar, some curious, some skeptical, some openly doubtful. Jessica could feel their eyes as she mounted Ember for the first time outside the privacy of her own corral. The Mustang shifted beneath her, the old panic trembling just under his skin. But Jessica's hands were steady. Ethan gave her a thumbs up from the edge of the arena, his pride and hope radiating from his small frame. The starter's pistol cracked through the air, and suddenly they were moving. Dozens of horses surging forward, riders shouting, hooves pounding against earth still slick with morning dew. Jessica's heart raced. Ember stumbled at the noise, skittering sideways, nearly unseating her. But Jessica's words, calm and low, coaxed him back, guiding him toward the first bend. Mrs. Callahan surged ahead, her gelding running with the precision of long training, the crowd cheering as she claimed an early lead. The course wound through pastures, across shallow streams, up rocky inclines that tested every rider's resolve. Mud pooled in low spots, and more than one horse faltered, riders cursing as boots and stirrups came loose. Ember was quick but cautious, every muscle alert, his breaths coming in sharp bursts. Jessica rode with her whole body, hands gentle but firm, eyes always forward. Early on, disaster struck, a broken stirrup as they crossed a narrow bridge. Jessica's foot slipped, pain shooting through her ankle, but she gritted her teeth, fighting for balance. She rode through the ache, improvising with the broken tack, leaning on everything she had learned in those quiet months of patience and persistence. Ember responded to her every cue, his trust growing with each mile. They passed the halfway point, still behind the leaders, but gaining ground with each obstacle overcome. Ethan's voice, carried by the wind, found her at every checkpoint, a steady anchor amid the chaos. The hardest part came just before the final stretch, where the course cut through a wooded glen. There, hidden in shadow, a loud cheer erupted as Mrs. Callahan's friends tried to rattle the competitors. Ember startled, his old fear rearing up, and for a heartbeat, Jessica thought all was lost. She closed her eyes, remembering those long nights by the corral, the slow earning of trust. She spoke to Ember with the calm she had practiced so many times, a thread of connection that refused to break. Gradually, the Mustang settled, moving forward step by step. Emerging from the trees, Jessica saw the finish line far ahead. Colorful banners whipping in the wind, the crowd a blur of excitement. Mrs. Callahan was still in front, her gelding pushing hard. Jessica urged Ember forward, digging deep for one last burst of strength. The world narrowed to the rhythm of hoofbeats, the rise and fall of Ember's breath, the pounding in Jessica's chest. Mud splashed, branches scraped, and still she rode, willing every doubt and fear to fall away. In the final 100 yards, something shifted. Ember, as if sensing Jessica's need, surged forward with a power she had never felt before. They closed the distance between themselves and Mrs. Callahan, passing her with a momentum born of months of trust and quiet perseverance. The crowd's roar grew, a tide that carried them to the finish, where Jessica leaned low over Ember's neck, feeling the wild joy of victory rising like a storm inside her. They crossed the line first, by inches, by a miracle, by every ounce of belief they had left. For a moment time hung suspended, the cheers and music and color swirling into a single point of light. Jessica slid from the saddle, legs shaking, arms open as Ethan ran to her, laughter and tears mingling in the dust at their feet. They had done what no one thought possible. They had given a second chance to a horse, and to themselves. The noise of the crowd ebbed into memory, leaving a hush over the festival grounds as the sun began to slide down the horizon. Jessica stood at the finish line, arms wrapped around Ethan, her body trembling with exhaustion and disbelief. Ember stood close, sides heaving, eyes bright and wild, not with fear, but with a new awareness. In that moment, the battered Mustang looked every bit a champion, his presence drawing awe instead of pity. Neighbors who had once whispered doubts now gathered nearby. Expressions changed from skepticism to admiration. Some clapped Jessica on the back, offering congratulations that just days before would have felt unimaginable. Children who had mocked Ethan now crowded around, asking to touch Ember, their curiosity blooming into wonder. Ethan basked in the attention. But more than that, he watched his mother with pride, seeing in her the courage that had lifted them both through the darkness of the past year. Jessica's thoughts flickered to the ranch, the sagging fences, the faded porch, the growing pile of bills, and realized, for the first time in so long, that the weight had shifted. Victory brought more than a blue ribbon and prize money. It was the feeling of having chosen hope again and again, of having believed when belief itself seemed almost reckless. She felt her late husband's presence in the wind, imagined his arm around her shoulders, his voice low and full of pride, sharing in this unlikely triumph. The prize money, when counted, was enough to catch up on mortgage payments and settle old debts. There was relief in that, a deep breath after years of feeling as if every day was spent at the edge of a cliff. Jessica wrote checks with steady hands, each one a promise to Ethan that home was not just a memory, but a future they would build together. Repairs began immediately. Friends and neighbors showed up with tools and lumber, eager to lend a hand to the family they had once doubted. Fences straightened, the barn's roof patched, and the land itself seemed to respond. The grass greener, the air sweeter. Mrs. Callahan, whose champion gelding had been bested by an outcast Mustang, approached Jessica in the days after the festival. The old rivalry was still there, but it was softened by respect. She offered a handshake, her words plain and without artifice. The loss, she admitted, had shown her that heart and determination could not be measured in pedigree or price. Jessica accepted with a nod, understanding that sometimes even the most entrenched skeptics could be changed by a moment of truth. Ember became more than just a horse on the Moore Ranch. He was a symbol. Children rode their bikes out to the edge of the property to see him graze, wide-eyed with stories of the wild horse who had won the big race. Jessica made space for them, letting them feed Ember apples and brush his coat, teaching them, as she had learned, that patience and kindness could transform even the most broken spirit. As spring deepened and new life spread across the land, Jessica and Ethan found themselves transformed alongside Ember. Their days, once colored by worry, now carried a quiet confidence. Ethan's laughter grew louder, his steps lighter, as he discovered his own resilience. Jessica, too, walked taller, her burdens eased by the knowledge that she could face the unknown and shape it into something worth holding on to. The ranch, saved from foreclosure, became a gathering place. Neighbors brought pie, coffee, stories of their own struggles and hard-won victories. In the evenings, Jessica still sat by the corral, reading aloud as the last light faded. Ember would wander close, ears flicking at the sound of her voice. His body relaxed, no longer haunted by invisible threats. Sometimes Ethan would join her, his head resting on her shoulder, their future stretching wide and open before them. The festival victory didn't erase their losses, nor did it fill every empty space left behind by grief. But it changed the shape of those spaces. Where once there was only ache, now there was gratitude, a deep awareness of what could grow in even the most unlikely ground. Jessica understood now that second chances were not given. They were fought for, risked, and tended like a fragile seed. Rumors of the crazy widow and her wild horse faded, replaced by a story of hope that traveled far beyond the county line. Other struggling ranchers came to her for advice, drawn by the quiet proof that what was broken did not have to stay that way. Jessica shared what she knew, but always ended with the same lesson: that real change began with the courage to believe, and with the patience to keep trying, even when every sign pointed toward giving up. On a quiet evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, Jessica watched Ember grazing beneath the wide Texas sky. She felt a peace she hadn't known in years, a certainty that life, for all its loss and hardship, still held room for redemption. Beside her, Ethan kicked his feet in the dust, already dreaming of next year's race, of new foals in the spring, of adventures that might await a boy and his mother and a Mustang named Ember. Their story, Jessica knew, would not be remembered for the doubts and difficulties, but for the moments when faith overcame fear, and for the truth that giving a second chance to a horse, to a family, to herself, could change everything.